There are moments when becoming conscious feels less like waking up and more like losing the ability to sleep. Most people imagine enlightenment as liberation. They imagine a mind finally breaking free from illusion, a person seeing reality clearly, and suffering becoming smaller because ignorance has disappeared. Across centuries, spiritual traditions have promised something close to this. Awaken, understand, detach, and you will become free. But Emil Cioran looked at awakening from the opposite direction. For him, consciousness was not necessarily a gift. It could be a wound. The more deeply a person looked into existence, the harder it became to accept the ordinary illusions that make life bearable. Hope, ambition, morality, religion, identity, even the desire to continue living could begin to look like psychological constructions designed to protect human beings from an unbearable truth. Cioran was not simply afraid of ignorance. He was fascinated by what might happen when ignorance disappears. And this is where his philosophy becomes disturbing, because perhaps the darkest question is not, what if we never discover the truth? Perhaps it is, what if we do? Cioran was born in Romania in 1911 and spent much of his intellectual life wrestling with insomnia, despair, death, religious doubt, and the strange absurdity of consciousness. He eventually settled in Paris, where he wrote in French and developed a philosophical style unlike almost anyone else. He did not construct philosophical systems. He wrote fragments, short explosions of thought, sentences that seemed less interested in proving something than in exposing something. And one of the things he exposed was the possibility that human beings may need illusions in order to survive. We usually think of ignorance as a weakness. Cioran suspected it might sometimes be mercy. Think about ordinary life. A person wakes up, goes to work, builds relationships, makes plans, worries about money, dreams about success, falls in love, becomes angry, seeks recognition, and imagines a future. None of this requires a complete understanding of existence. In fact, it may depend on not having one. We need to believe that tomorrow matters. We need to believe our struggles have meaning. We need to believe our identity is stable enough to build a life around. We need to believe that suffering is temporary and that happiness is worth pursuing. But what happens when consciousness begins questioning every one of these assumptions? What happens when you stop asking, "How can I live better?" and start asking, "Why should I live at all?" That question changes everything. It does not simply ask for a better answer, it attacks the foundation on which all the other answers were built. This is why awakening could become terrifying for Cioran. Because awareness does not always produce peace. Sometimes it produces distance. You begin watching yourself from outside. You notice your thoughts appearing before you choose them. You notice desires rising and disappearing. You realize that the person you call I changes constantly, yet you continue pretending there is a permanent self underneath it all. You become aware of your habits, your fears, your need for approval, your hidden motives, your biological impulses, your hunger for recognition, your fear of death, and suddenly the personality you spent years constructing begins to look less like an authentic self, and more like a mask held together by repetition. This is one of the dark sides of awakening. The ego does not always disappear peacefully. Sometimes it fights back, because the ego depends upon a story. I am this person. I have this purpose. I am going somewhere. My past means something. My future will become something. These beliefs give structure to existence, but radical self-awareness begins tearing holes in the story. Cioran understood that once you begin observing existence too closely, ordinary life can lose its natural appearance. Food becomes chemistry. Love becomes biology and psychology. Ambition becomes competition. Religion becomes a human response to uncertainty. Civilization becomes organized instinct. And even consciousness itself becomes something strange. You are suddenly looking at the machinery behind the experience, and once you see the machinery, it can become difficult to experience the illusion in the same innocent way. This is why Cioran's thought should not be confused with simple pessimism. Pessimism says life is bad. Cioran went somewhere more unsettling. He questioned our need to classify life as either good or bad. He wanted to expose the contradiction at the center of existence itself. We are conscious enough to understand that we will die, yet we continue behaving as if we are permanent. We understand that everything changes, yet we desperately seek permanence. We know that our desires often create suffering, yet we continue producing new desires. We know that happiness disappears, yet we spend enormous portions of our lives pursuing it. Perhaps the tragedy is not simply that life contains suffering. Perhaps the tragedy is that consciousness allows us to recognize the structure of suffering while remaining trapped inside it. Imagine waking up inside a dream. At first, you are excited. You realize the world around you is not what you believed. You have discovered something extraordinary. But then, imagine that you cannot wake up completely. You know the world is an illusion, but you still have to live inside it. You still have to eat, still work, still interact with people, still pretend, still participate. That is close to the psychological territory Cioran explored. The awakened person may understand the artificial nature of many human values, yet still have to live according to them. You know money is invented, but you still need it. You know status is temporary, but you still feel humiliation. You know beauty fades, but you still fear aging. You know people die, but you still become attached. You know identity is unstable, but you still defend your name. Knowledge does not automatically liberate you from the mechanisms it reveals. Sometimes it makes you painfully conscious of your imprisonment. This is where Cioran becomes particularly relevant to modern life. We live in an age obsessed with self-awareness. Psychology tells us to understand ourselves. Social media encourages us to construct ourselves. Self-help teaches us to improve ourselves. Meditation encourages us to observe ourselves. Therapy asks us to examine ourselves. Philosophy asks us to question ourselves. But Cioran would probably ask an uncomfortable question. What if there is a limit beyond which self-knowledge stops helping? What if you can analyze yourself so deeply that spontaneity disappears? What if every emotion becomes an object of observation? You are angry, but instead of simply experiencing anger, you analyze why you are angry. You fall in love, but immediately question whether it is attachment, projection, loneliness, biology, or fantasy. You achieve something, but instead of enjoying it, you analyze your desire for achievement. You become happy, and then you become afraid that the happiness will disappear. Consciousness begins consuming experience. You are no longer simply living. You are watching yourself live. And Cioran understood the terrible distance that can create. There is a difference between knowing that you are alive and feeling alive. The first is intellectual. The second is existential. A person can understand everything and still feel nothing. Perhaps this is why Cioran was so suspicious of intellectual salvation. Knowledge can explain suffering without removing it. It can explain death without defeating it. It can explain fear without eliminating it. And sometimes explanation makes suffering more precise. The person who knows nothing may suffer blindly. The person who understands everything may suffer consciously. Which one is worse? Cioran never gives us a comfortable answer, but he repeatedly returns to the same abyss. Consciousness makes us capable of recognizing the absurdity of our condition. We are creatures that demand meaning from a universe that does not appear obligated to provide it. We want permanence inside a world built on change, We want justice despite endless injustice. We want certainty despite uncertainty. We want happiness without loss. And above all, we want existence to justify itself. But existence does not explain why it exists. This silence terrified Cioran, not because silence itself is evil, but because human beings are meaning-making creatures. When the universe refuses to answer, we create answers: religion, ideology, philosophy, national identity, personal ambition, romantic love, family, career, art, legacy. Even the idea of becoming a better version of yourself can become another meaning-making structure. Cioran did not necessarily argue that these things should simply be destroyed. His writing is more ambiguous than that. He understood that illusions can be beautiful. Perhaps beauty itself depends partly upon illusion. The problem begins when we forget that they are illusions. This is one of the most fascinating ideas in his work. Maybe human beings do not survive because they possess truth. Maybe they survive because they possess stories. And perhaps awakening is dangerous because it begins revealing the seams in those stories. The person who sees too clearly may become unable to believe with the same intensity. This is particularly visible in Cioran's relationship with religion. He was fascinated by mysticism and religious experience, even while remaining deeply skeptical. He understood why human beings were drawn toward transcendence. Religion promises that suffering has a place. Death has a meaning. The universe has an intelligence behind it. Your existence is not accidental. Your suffering is not meaningless. Your death is not the end. For someone confronting existential despair, these ideas are enormously powerful. But Cioran repeatedly stood at the border between belief and disbelief. He could admire mystical experience while doubting the explanations attached to it. He could long for transcendence while distrusting the human desire to invent transcendence. And this contradiction is essential to understanding him. Cioran did not simply reject meaning. He seemed haunted by the need for it. That is far more interesting, because the person who does not care about meaning has no existential problem. The real torment begins when you desperately want meaning while simultaneously suspecting that meaning is something you invented. You want to believe, but you cannot fully believe. You want to reject everything, but you cannot fully reject the human need for something beyond yourself. You are trapped between faith and skepticism, between hope and lucidity, between the desire to live and the awareness of death. And perhaps this is why Cioran's writing feels so intimate. He does not speak like a philosopher standing safely outside human suffering. He speaks like someone standing inside it. He does not pretend that intelligence makes you immune. Sometimes intelligence simply gives suffering a vocabulary. And that brings us to the most disturbing dimension of Cioran's idea of awakening. What if the purpose of illusion is not to deceive us, but to protect us? What if certain beliefs are psychological survival mechanisms? A child believes the world is safe. An adult learns that it is not. A young person believes the future is open. Age teaches limitation. A lover believes the relationship will last. Time eventually introduces uncertainty. A person believes they are special. Life repeatedly demonstrates how replaceable everyone is. Perhaps growing up is partly the gradual destruction of illusions, but complete awakening would mean seeing all the way through. No comforting story, no permanent identity, no guaranteed future, no final explanation, no escape from mortality, only existence itself. And Cioran asks us to consider whether human beings are actually designed to tolerate that level of clarity. Maybe we need a little darkness to survive the light. Maybe we need mystery. Maybe we need hope precisely because hope is not knowledge. Because hope says it could be different, even when there is no evidence. That irrational belief can keep a person moving. Cioran understood its power, and perhaps that is why his philosophy should not be reduced to despair. There is a strange freedom hidden inside his darkness. Once you recognize that many of your beliefs are constructions, you gain the possibility of choosing them consciously. You can stop pretending that your ambitions are eternal. You can stop demanding that life provide a perfect explanation. You can recognize the absurdity without necessarily surrendering to it. You can laugh at your own seriousness. You can see the ego without worshipping it. You can recognize death without allowing it to erase every moment of life. Cioran never provides a simple formula for this. Perhaps he could not. His value lies somewhere else. He forces us to confront the possibility that awakening is not always beautiful. Sometimes awareness hurts. Sometimes understanding isolates. Sometimes seeing through illusion makes the world feel less real. But perhaps there is another side to this. Maybe the goal is not to eliminate illusion completely. Maybe the goal is to become conscious enough to know when you are using one. You can love while knowing love is temporary. You can pursue success while knowing success cannot save you from death. You can build a life while knowing it will eventually disappear. You can create meaning while knowing meaning is not written into the universe. And perhaps this is the strange middle ground Cioran leaves us with. Not blind belief, not complete nihilism, but lucid participation. You know the game is temporary. You play anyway. You know the stage will disappear. You perform anyway. You know the story will end. You continue reading. Because perhaps life does not become meaningful after we discover some final cosmic answer. Perhaps meaning exists in the act of living despite the absence of one. And maybe this is the paradox Cioran spent his life circling. The more conscious you become, the harder it may be to believe in life. But the more conscious you become, the more extraordinary it becomes that you are alive at all. The same awareness that reveals death also reveals existence. The same consciousness that exposes illusion can experience beauty. The same mind capable of asking why life has meaning can watch sunlight fall through a window and feel, for a moment, no question is necessary. Perhaps Cioran's darkest lesson is therefore not that awakening destroys life. It is that awakening destroys the version of life we thought we understood. And that can be terrifying, because when the old illusions disappear, you may temporarily find yourself standing in emptiness. But emptiness is not necessarily the end. It may simply be the space left behind when certainty disappears. Cioran stared into that space for decades. He refused easy answers. He distrusted optimism. He distrusted systems. He distrusted the promises people make to themselves about tomorrow. Yet, he continued writing. And that fact may be more revealing than any of his sentences. A man obsessed with the meaninglessness of existence continued producing words. A man fascinated by death continued creating. A man who distrusted hope continued speaking to people he would never meet. Perhaps that contradiction was the answer he never wanted to formulate. Maybe the human response to meaninglessness is not always surrender. Sometimes it is creation. Sometimes it is laughter. Sometimes it is music. Sometimes it is friendship. Sometimes it is a sentence written at 3 a.m. by someone who cannot sleep. And perhaps awakening is not about reaching a final state where all suffering disappears. Perhaps awakening means becoming capable of seeing the darkness without needing to lie about it. Cioran feared enlightenment because enlightenment, taken to its extreme, could strip existence of its comforting illusions. But perhaps that is also where its strange freedom begins. Once you stop demanding that life be something it cannot be, you can finally encounter it as it is. Temporary, uncertain, contradictory, beautiful, terrifying, and completely alive. Maybe the deepest awakening is not discovering that nothing matters. Maybe it is discovering that nothing is guaranteed. And realizing that despite knowing this, you are still here, still breathing, still watching, still choosing, still alive. And for Cioran, perhaps that was the darkest mystery of all.